you, and we certainly appreciate you. And what we would like for you to do is to give us some background, education, and some of your experiences so that our audience might know more about you and some of the things that have happened to you since you first started with us more than 9 years ago. Let's do it from that perspective.
Well, Dr. Haney, I am in the 11th grade. I go to the Nashville School of Arts, where my specialty is music. I play trumpet and French horn and piano. I do jazz band, classical, and marching band with the Pearl Cone Marching Band in North Nashville. Growing up, I loved music and I still do, but I also had a pull towards politics. I've always enjoyed learning why our government is set up the way that it is and why laws are established and the process that we go through to get said laws established. And I've always wanted to have a say-so in things, and so my dream is to be a political commentator. I do plan on going to college for it. I'm undecided as of right now, but that is my lifelong dream, and I believe that I will have a show of my own one day. That's basically sums up my background and why I'm on the show, and I feel like the show gives me kind of a head start on giving my opinion and spreading my knowledge to others, because ultimately that's all I want to do. And I feel like I can appeal to my age group a lot better, seeing as they'll probably respond better to someone who looks like them and is of their same, age range, as opposed to listening to Fox News or CNN.
Very good. And so, Lana, let's talk about, I think we said that the topic today is the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And during the last part of this segment, let's have you to give us some information in reference to the definition of imperialism, colonialism in the African continent, and why this should be important in terms of what we're talking about today.
Well, imperialism and colonialism are often confused. Most people think that they're interchangeable, though they are not. Colonialism is a result of imperialism, and imperialism is when a larger, more powerful country takes control of a smaller country. For instance, imperialism could be described as Europe's influence on North America, or Europe's influence on Africa, which we'll be getting into in the next segment. Colonialism, when most people hear it, they think of Jamestown. They think of the early settlers here in the United States, but most people fail to realize that colonialism was a widespread thing, though it came in waves. There was the imperialism around the time of the early United States, and then new imperialism at the end of the 19th century, which is what we'll be focusing on today.
And this is when Africa is divided during this period of new imperialism, I think
Yes.
as it was called.
This is when British, German, all these forces came in and changed the face of Africa forever.
Very good. And so what we'll do, we'll take our first commercial break in the next minute or so. But what I want you to do during this second segment is to enlarge upon this whole idea of imperialism and colonialism, and speak specifically to the African continent, because I think that you've got a lot of information in reference to the relationship between these three ideas. And what I'd like for you to do is to demonstrate to me, because I was somewhat reluctant to talk about this as a topic with you this morning, but I think you've demonstrated that you've got some good information in reference to it, and that you're ready to prepare to deliver it. So when we take our first commercial break, we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to go full force into telling the audience of the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. to the second segment of the show for today, and then we'll talk about the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And
Yep.
then we can get into it. We'll have 8 minutes to
This
do
is going to be 8, right?
Yeah,
and then
8
10.
minutes, then 10 minutes to do the second.
Got it. I think that I'm going to make this segment like leading up to imperialism and then the 10 minutes like during and after.
Okay, yeah,
Okay,
well,
yeah.
however you want to do it.
Okay.
As long as you can keep on doing it and keep on speaking and making noise over there, you don't have any problem. The only problem with television is when it goes silent. Nobody says anything. See, because that's
You
when
don't have that problem
that's
with
when
me.
people stop and look, start around.
For they'll be listening
look.
in bed and they leave and sit up
stop.
and
It's gone silent. So,
Oh, man.
television don't go silent. No talk show. But I think this is a good show. It's demonstrating you got some knowledge and some information that.
Did you hear my neck pop?
What?
Did you hear me pop my neck?
Was that your neck?
Yeah.
I thought that was you. Let me see.
Well, I already did.
What, you pocket?
Uh-huh. I was like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's giving us some information in reference to the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And so, Alana, let's take this second segment to become involved with what we mean when we say what kind of impacts are we talking about and what were the consequences of all of this activity and et cetera. Speak from that perspective.
To fully understand the effects of colonialism and imperialism in Africa, we must study what imperialism and colonialism is and what made it unique to what happened to Africa. So in the last segment, I talked about how imperialism and colonialism are not interchangeable, though most people believe that they are. In imperialism, the Webster definition for imperialism is when a larger country takes control of a smaller country because they're less powerful. And whatever the larger the mother country does is up to the mother country. And we see that in effects in like early colonial United States, Jamestown, etc. But what happened to Africa is much different than what happened in North America because the United States ended up becoming an empire. We see during this new imperialism period, the late 19th century to the early 20th, and the United States around this time, we were experiencing the Industrial Revolution. America was on a high. We were bringing in lots of money. There was new waves of immigration. Things were on the up and up for most Americans, but in Africa, things were totally different. The scramble for Africa is the term coined to describe how European countries were fighting and scrambling to carve out Africa and to make it into new colonies so that they could have power in Africa and so that Africa could feed their greed. Now, the scramble for Africa had 3 different categories that all made it come together. The first was economic. Now, like I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution was going on during this time period, and not just in America, but also in Europe. And because of this, European countries were constantly looking for countries where they could export raw materials, where they could have a profitable market, and a good, safe, and secure place to build companies and to mine, etc. And so they immediately thought Africa and Asia, but Africa obviously got a more negative effect of imperialism. Now, after they figured out that Africa would be just such an economic boost, the political factors came into it. Now, some of the big European powers like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, etc., all of these countries were fighting for power. They all wanted to be the next big country, the next this, the next that. And one of the easiest ways to be able to do that is to conquer and colonize these African then tribes and ethnic groups. They weren't necessarily colonies or countries yet. Now, the last is social. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, things in Europe weren't always on the up and up like how I described they were in the United States. There was lots of social displacement from people in rural areas whose homes are now like mining towns or like factory towns. There was lots of unemployment and lots of homelessness. And so initially, even before these European powers discovered the political and all these other sides, all these other positives for colonizing Africa, the first thought that these European countries had was, oh, we're just going to send our surplus population to these settler colonies in Africa, and that'll help with the unemployment and the homelessness. And that was the initial thought. That was what was supposed to happen to Africa. But of course, we see in 2019 that that did not happen. Now, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, he kind of knew that since the scramble for Africa was so intense that there would be conflict. And so his way to combat this conflict was to have the Berlin Convention. Now, representatives from all the European countries who would eventually go on to colonize Africa were represented, but there were no representatives from the African continent. And that's going to prove detrimental very, very soon. But in this convention, in this conference, the Berlin Act was birthed, and that basically was a guideline of how to rule the Africans, how to tame them, what to do, how to work with the natives, et cetera, and et cetera. But of course, it was not very accurate because there was no one from Africa present at this. And the biggest thing that came out of the Berlin Convention was the fact that these European powers sat with a big map of Africa and carved out new countries in Africa. So that's how the modern day face of Africa, that's how that came to be. So now that Africa's carved out and now that they have a plan for Africa, they start to put it into action. These European powers are coming over, basically telling these tribes and these groups that, you know, you're under our jurisdiction now. And new imperialism and the Industrial Revolution, this came almost immediately after the end of slavery. And so now the Africans are worried. They're like, slavery just ended and now we're just being re-enslaved in our own homes. And that was the beginning of the horrible, horrible impact that imperialism had on Africa.
And so in a real sense, the slave system, the slave trade, had decimated the African population, but as that population came back, there was a new wave,
Definitely.
a new desire on the part of Europeans to do other things
Definitely.
with Africa, to enslave Africans on their own continent.
Because at the end of the slave trade, which was highly profitable, these European countries were looking almost immediately for a new way to bring in profit. And the Industrial Revolution came at a very, very great time, but there was a lack of workers and a lack of raw materials, both of which they decided they were going to get from Africa.
Good, very good. And of course, Lana, what we'll do, we'll take our second commercial break, but I do want you to understand that I thought that the information that you gave in reference to that sort of highlighted it, and I'm pleased with the activity that you did in bringing that part of us together. But what I wanted to do with this final segment is to give you an opportunity to bring all of this information together and simply to talk about the impact that imperialism had upon the African continent. And I think that that'll be enough for us. And so we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Because sometimes I don't have anything to say in reference to it. So, pull it all together. Now, what the next show is for
Walker?
Walker? Is that Walker? Uh-huh.
What time do you think we'll be done? Around 2?
Around 2:30 or somewhere.
I gotta be at the church at 5, so we'll come home and then go back.
We have to roll that down. That's some time we didn't use, you know that.
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
So you don't see it, but I can see it.
Yeah, I don't. I'm just going with the flow.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. On the wall? Yes. Okay.
You like that more? Is it gonna say we'll be right back? Like,
This is not the original.
no. Okay, so you know how we were having the problem that that big thing was kind of cut off? Well, he just put another one up there. And so now you can see the full comments with Dr. James Haney.
Uh-huh.
So do you want to keep that?
Yeah, let's keep that. Yeah, let's keep that. Okay, this is the last segment, 10 minutes. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's given us some information in reference to the impact of colonialism and imperialism, Lana, had upon the African continent. And I think you gave us some excellent information in terms of laying out the conflict that we have to deal with. But let's take the last 10 minutes of this program to give you an opportunity to develop this idea of the impact and the reasons for some of the things that we're talking about here.
Now, one of the biggest effects of imperialism and colonialism on Africa was the loss of culture. There was this idea that the Europeans had that, oh, we're the smartest and the most able people in the world, and so everybody should try to be more like Europe. And so after carving out Africa at the Berlin Convention, these powers believed that they were going to take their Western ideals and Western culture and Western language and throw it onto Africa, which in turn stripped Africans of their native tongue and their native clothing and their way of life before they were disturbed. One of the darker effects of imperialism is ethnic conflict. Now, most people, they hear about different African countries that are in civil war or that are just in the dumps, and they hear about it and they believe, oh, Africa, they're just crazy and they're this and that and they need to be tamed. But most people fail to realize that there is a reason why these African countries are in the state that they're in. In 1994, the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Most people don't know that back when Germany had control of Rwanda, a lot of times they had this system of racism and segregation between the Tutsis and the Hutus, and often the Germans would cater more to Tutsis, which really wedged the Tutsis and the Hutus apart. About 30, not even 30, a few years after the end of imperialism, though its effect has never really ended, a few years after the official end of imperialism, we see
Formal imperialism.
exactly we see and new imperialism. We see the Rwandan genocide, and most people think, oh, and I'm sure in 1994, the Americans and Europeans who were watching the genocide from the comfort of their homes were just like, oh, these Africans, they need to be tamed and they need somebody to come in and help. But they failed to realize that because of this systematic racism that the Germans put upon the Tutsis and the Hutus, it drove them apart. And so the Hutus finally gained control of Rwanda, and in 1994 killed 800,000 Tutsis in the span of 2 or 3 months, I believe. And a lot of people fail to realize where this type of stuff comes from. For instance, in the Congo, they're in civil war right now. A lot of people don't understand why they're in civil war or what's happening or why the M23 has control of the Congo, but it all stems back from imperialism. It stems back from pitting these countries against each other. It stems from ripping them out of their homes, forcing them to work, forcing them to find shelter in these gangs, in these groups, in these terrorist groups, forcing them to compete with Europeans for a way to live. We see in the Virunga State Park, which is home to the rare mountain gorillas in the Congo. The Congo is currently under the control of the M23, and the state park is struggling to stay open while there are powers that are coming in that are trying to mine in the park, though mining is illegal in the park, and that are trying to take away the livelihood of these people. And it just makes me sick that so many outsiders don't realize that Africa as a whole, the continent, did not choose to be the way that it is. And it certainly did not choose to be portrayed the way that it is. And so I feel like it is my duty on the show to be able to bring a different insight into stuff like this, because I know that once I first learned about the Rwandan genocide, it scared me. I thought, how could people be so cruel to each other? Then I realized people aren't naturally just that cruel to each other. There's some type of outside, interference, and I realized that that was Europe. That was people coming in and pitting these countries together. Oh, when I mentioned in the last segment that at the Berlin Convention there were no representatives from Africa there, when they were carving out what the countries, all these borders and whatnot, oftentimes they would separate ethnic groups and tribes that were allies, that had similar like farming techniques or agricultural techniques, that would split up these countries and then put them, or they would make a new country or like a new colony with ethnic groups that didn't really get along with each other, that had different ways of life. For instance, with the Tutsis and the Hutus, I want to say that the Hutus tended to be more cattle herders and the Tutsis were more workers. And so Germans would often favor the Tutsis because this was during the Industrial Revolution, and they would put those people in the industries, while the Hutus were people who should have been around more cattle herders and should have been around people who had a similar way of life as them. And all these little things caused major problems. Ethnic conflict is still going on in Africa. There are some conflicts that are still going on from the period of new imperialism. Like I mentioned with Rwanda, a lot of the Hutus who were killing Tutsis in Rwanda fled to the Congo. And now we see that the Congo is in civil war. And it's honestly just, it never ends. It's like the domino effect. You come in and you tip this domino, and then all these people are affected and they go on to affect other people, and it never ends. And so when people say that, European powers need to come in and tame Africans, or when Americans say that they need to be Americanized so that they're civilized and so that they can work together, it's not their fault. It is purely because people came into their home, stole land from them, and left them. They took the raw materials from Africa. They took so much gold, ivory, etc., stuff that they were originally trading, but Europe became greedy and they figured, I don't want to trade, this just should be mine. And so they came and they stole land, they stole culture, they stole resources, and they stole happiness. I mentioned in the last segment that new imperialism and the Industrial Revolution came pretty close after the end of the slave trade. These people were already being uprooted from their homes and shipped overseas to work for people who didn't care about them in the slightest. And now there's another form of slavery, but just from the comfort of their own homes. And that's not right. And I feel like a lot of countries, other continents failed Africa. We as Americans failed Africa because even in 1994 during the Rwandan genocide, it was televised. How did we allow that to go on for 2-3 months, allow 800,000 Tutsis to be slaughtered with clubs and machetes and be beheaded and kidnapped and recruited into all these militant groups? I feel like the country and our ignorance towards the problem honestly allowed a lot of this stuff to go on. And this is not the first instance of America letting something go on. And this is not the first instance of America turning a blind eye to colonialism. We see that with the natives. We took their land, started the reservation policy, and in reality uprooted them from their native lands, tried to Americanize them, and then just left them to fend for themselves. And that obviously had negative effects.
And so, Alana, so what you're saying here is that there's been a real difficult problem